All right, we just wrapped up evaluation of breeding cattle as we begin to try to sort through the data and which data points are important, particular operations, and again, making our first cut on whether it be a set of bulls or cows that we may want to use, those types of things. So now the next step is we've decided which bulls or females are acceptable based on their pedigrees, based on their data. Now let's go into the visual evaluation. And so as you can see on this picture here, there's lots of different points that we can look at in visual evaluation of the cattle. As a purebred breeder, you're probably going to fine-tune those points a little bit more because, again, we're trying to breed the next best and begin to fine-tune the different traits of an animal. For a commercial producer, we may be kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture things there. But as you can see with that photo there, you know, we've got rib, we've got all the parts that we look at. I like to divide up when we're making our selection process. We start with structure, and I think structure is extremely important, especially in our bulls, because they've got to find the cows to breed them, but then they also have to be able to jump up and mount those cows. And so there's a lot of pressure on the joints as they mount them, as well as when they come down off of those cows. And so good set of feet and legs are extremely important. So we start off with that, then we move into the middle of those cattle, the depth of body and shape of rib. Then we go into and we look at the amount of muscling that they have. And then we look at just the step back and the balance and eye appeal, and we look at the femininity or the masculinity, depending on if we're looking at bulls or females there. And so those are all the things that we began to look at as we began to look at visual selection. This next series of pictures I took at a field day that I did in Central Texas years ago. And as you can see, we just drew on this calf with white paint that's washable to begin to point out some of the points that we're looking at and make some of these decisions. So the first thing we looked at is structure. And we started from the ground up. We started by looking at the hooves and the feet of these cattle. In bulls, I'm probably a little more critical on the hoof and foot structure of them now versus 10, 15 years ago, because we've seen some scenarios where these cattle were fed too hard, trying to get additional marbling, additional performance out of them to get them fat so that they look good. And then we've got some acidosis and maybe some founder problems. And so looking at that foot is extremely important there. We can find some deformities in that foot structure that may have been that may go back to grain overload or acidosis there. So we start there and we make our way up there. And as you can see in the picture, on the front end of this particular heifer, we've got some lines drawn from the top of her back there and her blades to the point of her shoulder all the way back to the elbow there. And as you can see that there's about a 90-degree angle there if we look at that. If that angle actually gets wider, we would call those cattle were a little bit too straight, didn't have enough angulation out of their front end. If that angle gets narrower than 90 degrees, then those cattle may have too much angulation and have some challenges moving as well. All of those joints work together. So if an animal gets too straight in the front end, where that shoulder's pushed back and the angle's bigger, we will typically see the foot at the ground is pushed back and the knees pushed forward. And we call those cattle, sometimes those bulls that get into that, or females, we call them, they will buck over, where they're pushing their knee over to try to relieve some pressure there. Then we take it a step back and we go and look at the levelness of hooks to pins there. Sometimes if you hear that in the show ring, that's a little misleading, because cattle are always going to slope just a little bit from their hooks to pins. That's just the natural structure of the pelvis. A lot of times we think we should be saying their level in their tail head and the way that their tail sets into there. But we don't want cattle where their pin bones sit up too high, and we also don't like cattle where their pins set too low, because those cattle that are sit too low, oftentimes those cattle may be a little bit sickle hocked. So all the pieces begin to put together and form together. You can see I kind of drew there a crude representation of the pelvis of that particular animal, and you can see as we look at her, her hook bones there in the front are a little bit higher than her pin bones there. And we begin to draw those lines down, and we imagine where the skeleton is, and the lines represent the actual skeleton of that animal. As you can see, this particular animal has some angulation there. Where I've got that stick going from the ground up, you can see there's some angle there in her hock. Now, if we had an animal that was too straight on her back end or post-legged, those angles, the joints would begin to line up. And we'll show you some pictures of those cattle here in a minute. But this heifer's got a nice set all the way at the ground, all the way as we move up on both her front end as well as the rear end of that particular heifer. Then we begin to look at balance, and as we begin to look at the proportionality of this animal and how we put all those traits together, and that's what the other lines that are drawn there as well. So if we look at this particular bull, and imagine as we go back to the lines that I drew on that Angus heifer, as we look at this Simmental bull, and this is an older picture, and as you can see, if we study this animal here, you can see that that angle is a little bit bigger than probably 90 degrees. And as you study him, and we study as his shoulders push back a little bit, all the way to the ground, his knee is almost right on top of the front of his foot or his hoof there. And so that bull could have some challenges. The heavier those cattle get that have some of those structural defects, they will begin to break down and have some challenges down the road. Here's another example of rear leg conformation. This animal would be a little bit sickle hock there. You can see the picture diagram on the right and the bull on the left there. So he's got a little too much angulation. Versus this one has got not enough angulation. And if we imagine those lines drawn on this bull, you can see, look how straight he is, all the way from his hip straight down. There's not a lot of angulation in the hock on these cattle. Now, if we look at and study the way that these cattle move, an animal that's sound, typically the back foot will be placed where the front foot picked up. If they're sickle hocked, they will overstep themselves. And so sometimes you hear the term, they got under themselves. If they're too straight, there's not enough flexibility in that hock to where that they can meet where their front foot left off. And so those cattle will be shorter strided. So it takes them more steps to get from point A to point B. I relate that a lot of times to when I'm walking with my younger son who's 6 years of age. It takes me one step. Well, he's got to walk 2 or 3 steps to make up for my one step. And that's what you see on these straight cattle. They've got to take extra steps versus one that is structurally sound. And the more steps they take, the more they begin to wear out the joints, and their longevity can be affected there. There's also a lot of pressure that's placed on those joints, and they will begin to wear down as well, and we'll get some swelling. And cattle that are post-legged, they're most of the time they're going to be shorter lived than those that are sound. Here's a bull as we look from behind. We typically want the hind legs to point forward. This particular bull is also sickle hocked, like on the first picture we showed. And so you can see the hocks are hocked in what we term cow hock there. Here's a bull that is actually a little bow-legged in that design. And again, you want those joints to line up from all the way from the foot all the way up to the hock there. And he's bow-legged. A lot of times these cattle that are bow-legged or that are straight will also have some swelling or fluid that's built up on those hocks as well. So if we look at these 3 pictures here, to just show you some angulation differences in them. The top left, probably too much angulation. That animal's just a little bit sickle hocked. The top right, this particular cow is just, you can see on the hind joints there, she's straight in line, and on her front end, those joints are all lined up. The bottom picture is more in line, and you can see then through that, as we look at the scapula, to the shoulder, back to the elbow on that front end structure of this cow, it's about a 90-degree angle there. And on the hind end, you can see we've got some angulation, but not to the extent of that top left picture. So that gives you some examples of too much angulation, not enough, or too straight, and then more of in line of what we're desiring here. So I put this picture of this car I pulled off the internet years and years ago, flat, broke down on the side of the road. It's critical for a bull or cow to have a good set of wheels under them, a good set of feet and legs, because no matter how good they are, if they can't get out, travel, graze, forage for grass, and the ability to reproduce, they mean nothing. And so there's no value to them, to the ranch, whether it be a purebred or commercial operation. So skeletal-wise, that's the first trait that I always look at when I'm selecting a bull.